southernmost part of Houston, right where Houston touches the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a bridge right there that you can cross, and you'll be on Galveston Island. Coming up here, it took 16 hours to drive the distance from Galveston to Lexington. Had I gone on another 8 hours, I could have made it to Washington, D.C. The reason I tell you that is so that you can imagine in reverse from Washington, D.C. to Galveston, except not today. Imagine in 1865, no cars, just horses, all the way south to Houston, right where I lived, and then, well, at the time, you'd have to take a boat across to get to Galveston. And in 1865, that trip took 2.5 years. Enslaved African Americans on Galveston Island, Texas, had been declared free 2.5 years earlier, declared by Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, and the news finally reached Galveston on June 19, 1865. Now, perhaps it took that long to get to Galveston, or more likely, members of the Confederacy weren't eager to spread the word, or plantation owners hoped to get a couple of more harvests in before the news was shared. Whatever the reason, June 19th, which in good Southern speech gets rolled into Juneteenth, is regarded as the day that finally the word came to the last enslaved people in this nation that they were legally free. Sam Collins lives in Galveston today, and his ancestors were among those who were freed on that day. He helped make Juneteenth a state holiday in Texas, and it's now celebrated in 43 states. But Sam Collins doesn't just want to celebrate that day, he wants progress to continue. Because it's not just one proclamation that does it. It takes acts again and again for freedom really to happen. This year, Friday, the celebration honored Ruby Bridges. Some of you will remember in 1960 when she became the first African-American child in this nation to desegregate white elementary schools. If you think 2.5 years is a long time to wait for the news of emancipation, imagine waiting 100 years for a school to be desegregated from 1860 to 1960. I mean, can that really be true? Does it take us that long to make changes? This year's celebration in Galveston started somberly, remembering those who had died in Charleston just 2 days earlier. But this year is the 150th celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, and so it was read aloud, just like it was read aloud there on that island 150 years ago, and prayers were spoken and hymns were sung, and one of the highlights was renaming a street in Galveston. It is now Annie Mae Charles Boulevard, named in honor of the first female member of the Galveston police force, who happened to be African American, and who served for years. And there she was this weekend, riding in the parade down the street that was named after her, now that she's 101 years old. And then the picnic began, and the bands played, and families enjoyed celebrating the day. I love that celebration that happens on Juneteenth. But this year has not seemed like one for progress. As much as we're seeing clearly how much progress there is still to be made, it must be exhausting to be black in America, constantly having to navigate the perils of the color line and having to live within a system that repeatedly reminds you of your contested existence. I mean, what a burden that must be to live under. And how easy it is for white Americans to fail to see these difficulties, to accept injustices just as the way things are, and to continue to see the story of America from a European perspective rather than from the perspective of those who were brought here enslaved and on boats, or even the enslavement and destruction of cultures already present here before the boats even arrived. John Stewart used a phrase this week that I had never heard before. He said, racist wallpaper. And I've never heard that before. I don't know if he invented it or it's just now getting to me, but he said in South Carolina, the roads that black people drive on are named after the Confederate generals who fought to keep black people from being able to drive freely on that road. And the Confederate flag still flies over South Carolina. He said that's insanity. That's racist wallpaper. It's those things that are always around us that we don't even see. Always in the background, always there surrounding our lives. And he said we can no longer allow that. And I was thinking if Galveston can rename a street, so can Charleston. And if you can lower the American flag to half-mast to honor those lost in Charleston, surely you can lower the Confederate flag 150 years back into history. The problem is that now I have a word to describe that racism that is visually around us, racist wallpaper, and I can no longer help but see it, even if I'm late to see that it's always been there. It has to be removed. It serves no purpose to preserve those old battles when the reality of our lives today is multicultural. It's multiracial, and one of the best days for aiming for justice and freedom and equality for all is this very day. Because divisiveness in all of its forms has to have had its day. Diversity is the word for today, not divisiveness. But divisiveness is what is at the very heart of this scripture reading today. Paul had started a church in Corinth. It is a diverse church. Rich people, poor people, different ethnicities, different ages, all focused on one faith and one belief. Now, Paul has gone on to start other churches, and the folks in Corinth are on their own. And what do we do when we're left on our own? Well, we lose our focus. We see our differences more. We stop listening to one another. We want our own ways. We let the worst out. We forget our focus. We lose our center. That's what happened in Corinth. So in this letter, Paul reminds them of why it worked, why the church worked when he was with them. Because they focused on Christ and they followed Christ's way. They said that they would live in love, and they had done that, but not any longer. Because love is a high calling, and it's hard to do sometimes. It takes effort, it takes acceptance and forgiveness and humility. And in this church, love had given way to divisiveness. So Paul reminds them with these words. He said, I have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. My heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in my affections, only in yours. I couldn't believe that Paul said that. I mean, it's so in your face, it's so out loud. He's saying to them, you stop loving like you used to. You stop loving like you know you can. You've turned inward. You've focused on yourself, your own kind, your own needs, your own desires. You've forgotten the call to live with one another and for one another beyond yourself, because that's what love really is. Love is not about you, but about the other. Paul says, I have to speak to you as children. Open wide your hearts. That's what they needed to hear. That's what we need to hear. That's what America needs to hear. Sometimes we do it so well. And sometimes we can another, even violent toward one another in the words that we speak and the actions we take. Paul says, just like Jesus says, open wide your hearts. That's what Emanuel, A-M-E, Church in Charleston has done since their founding. They have testified to the Spirit working through people who have been ostracized and marginalized and treated as imposters, who have been told that they had no place in America. Mother Emanuel, as it is called, its pastors and its people, its prayers and its actions have shaped a vision of God's righteousness that has space for all. They have testified to the truth of the Scripture today. There is no restriction in our affections, only in yours. And their plea has been, open wide your hearts. And the witness of the people at Emmanuel hits us broadside, just like the words of Paul. Why are your hearts not open? Open so wide so that you can see and hear and know our lives. Can we not look at our society and examine the beliefs that we embody and practice? Why are we so enthralled by violence? Why does our daily existence depend on racist structures that are evident to those who are marginalized but invisible to the powerful? And perhaps most importantly, why do so many of us practice a willful ignorance of the pain of our black sisters and brothers? We refuse to rip down the racist wallpaper. We refuse to do anything about the proliferation of guns in our society. Are we really different from that church in Corinth? Or are we putting our love in action? Is it still in our hearts to right a wrong, to communicate a kindness, to create the world that we want, a just world, a world where black lives matter, a world in which gay love is sacred, a world of amazing diversity and beauty in that diversity, a world in which every life is precious? In World War II, there were people in Germany who saw what was happening and stood up and said no to the regime that said Jewish lives did not matter. They put a giant red X across the swastika, that symbol of racist power, saying no to those who lived on that side of prejudice and hate. And women in our church made this banner that's up here right now that proclaims we too will tell the truth and live on the side of love and not be afraid to say no. And in the 1960s, when America was in the midst of the civil rights movement, our church stood and spoke words clearly. We said, God has created the people of the earth to be one universal family, and we will work to break down every form of discrimination based on racial or ethnic difference. We said we would do that, and we boldly declared anyone who excludes, dominates, or patronizes their fellow men and women, however subtly, are resisting the Spirit of God and bringing contempt on the faith which they profess. And women in our church made this banner, showing all the hands coming together in peace under the hand and under the direction of God. This is our wallpaper of love and inclusion and equality and hope. But it must be lived beyond these church walls. We must be willing this day to commit ourselves to be the church that Jesus hopes will save the entire world with love. I mean, that sounds crazy, but our mission is exactly that, to be the church that saves the entire world with love. To do that, we must allow Christ to open our hearts wide. And that happens in prayer. And today our prayers must begin, they have to begin with us mourning our brothers and sisters whose lives were taken from us. Their pictures are inside your bulletin. We're going to light a candle for each 1. This is how we began to open our hearts. So we light a candle for Reverend Clementa Pinckney. He was 41, pastor of Emanuel. At 23, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. 4 years later, he was elected to the state Senate. He was a man of character, had a passion for helping the poor, for helping improve the quality of life for all. He was a husband, father of 2 children, and the light of his life must live on in our world. We light a candle for Sharonda Coleman Singleton, age 45. She was on the church's ministerial staff and worked 2 jobs at the high school as a speech therapist and as coach of the girls' track and field team. She was teaching them track, her principal said, but she also taught these young ladies how to be better young ladies. This is something that can never be replaced. She was a wife and a mother of 3 children, and the light of her life must live on in our world. We light a candle for Tywanza Sanders, age 26. We saw the man draw his gun during Bible study and pointed at his elderly aunt, Susie Jackson, and he shielded her, and he tried to talk the gunman into laying down his weapon, and everyone said that was so like him. He was a peacemaker in this life. He graduated from Allen University last year and worked full-time as a barber to pay his bills, but he wanted to pursue music, and 2 of Zach's friends taught him at U.S.A. and shared with Zach what an incredible young man he was. I mean, our lives do intertwine, and the light of his life must live on in the world. We light a candle for Susie Jackson, age 87, Tywanza's aunt, longtime Emanuel churchgoer. She sang in the choir, served as an usher. One thing people remember about her life, she considered church-going as non-negotiable. The light of her life must live on in the world. Light a candle for the Reverend Daniel Lee Simmons, Sr., age 74. He was a retired pastor from another church, but he came to Emanuel for worship every Sunday and Bible study every Wednesday night. He was a husband and father. The light of his life must live on in our world. We light a candle for DePayne Middleton, doctor, age 49, a minister who loved to sing. She was admissions coordinator at Southern Wesleyan University. The university president said she believed in helping students achieve their potential by connecting faith with learning. She had 4 daughters in junior high through college. The light of her life must live on in our world. Her at age 54, a librarian for 31 years for the Charleston County Library System. She loved finding answers like a detective, she said. And it was working with people she loved the most. Charleston City Council announced Thursday that it would rename the library branch where she worked in her honor. You can change the wallpaper around you. You can do it quickly. She was baptized as a child in the church, and she lived there her whole life. She was a wife and considered by her brothers and sisters to be the matriarch of the family. And the light of her life must live on in our world. We light a candle for Myra Thompson, age 59. She had traveled over on Wednesday night from Holy Trinity Reformed Episcopal Church, the church where her husband, the Reverend Anthony Thompson, served as vicar. She loved the church. She loved Jesus, and she was teaching a Bible study when she was killed. The light of her life must live on in the world. We light a candle for Ethel Lee Plants, age 70. She worked as a janitor in the municipal auditorium for 34 years and was said to rule the backstage. It was her responsibility and it was her pride and her joy. But so was Emanuel, where she served as a sexton. She loved worship and Bible study and served as an usher. The light of her life must live on in the world. We light one more candle. We light a candle for those people who need the light of Christ to shine in their hearts. Like the young man who committed these crimes. At his hearing, the chief magistrate recited the names of the people killed in the church just like we have today, and each time asked if any relative wanted to make a statement. Tawanza Sanders' mother said to him, "We welcomed you Wednesday night in our Bible study with welcome arms. Tawanza Sanders was my son. The Tawanza Sanders was my hero. Tawanza was my hero. May God have mercy on you." And Ethel Lance's daughter said, "You took something very precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never ever hold her again, but I forgive you. And I have mercy on your soul." DePayne Middleton Doctor's sister said, "One thing that DePayne taught us, that we are the family that love built. We have no room for hating, so we have to forgive. I pray God for your soul." And that candle burns for all of us, who also need forgiveness in our lives, who need mercy on our souls, who need to open wider our hearts. 10 candles burning on our table remind us that the light of Christ must live in our own lives. We cannot let violence close us down. We must allow Christ to open our hearts wide. We must love one another stronger. We must love our brothers and sisters better. We must work even harder to live the life that Jesus calls us to live. And so, as the bell tolls for each life lost, let us open our hearts to God. Let us now pray silently, and then we'll close together in the Lord's Prayer. Let us pray. Loving God, we know that you hear the